The brand on her hand was an ugly thing. A puckered, angry starburst of scar tissue burned into the back of her right hand, a thief's mark given to her for a loaf of bread when she was 12. Now, 6 years later, it was the first thing anyone ever saw. It was the reason she scrubbed floors on her knees in the coldest sculleries, her fingers raw and bleeding into the icy water. It was the reason she was paid in scraps and slept in a hayloft that smelled of mice and damp rot. It defined her. Thief. Outcast. Worthless. Ilara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wind slicing through the threadbare wool like claws. The capital of Eisenrath was a city of stone and frost, and the cold had a way of seeping into your bones, a permanent guest. She huddled in the shadow of a butcher's shop, the rich scent of roasting meat a cruel torment to her empty stomach. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The hunger was a dull, familiar ache, a constant companion like the brand on her hand. A small whimper drew her eye. A little boy, no older than 5, sat against the frozen wall, his face streaked with dirt and tears. His clothes were even more ragged than hers. He was shivering violently, his small body racked with tremors. Ilara's heart, a thing she often tried to keep locked away and silent, gave a painful throb. She looked down at the half-piece of hard bread in her pocket. It was her food for the next day. Maybe 2 if she was careful. It was everything she had. Without a thought, she broke it in half again. She knelt before the boy, holding out the larger piece. His eyes, wide and blue, stared at the offering as if it were a miracle. "Here," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. He snatched it with a grubby hand and devoured it in 3 desperate bites. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The momentary abatement of his shivering was enough. She watched him for a moment longer, then rose and melted back into the shadows. The gnawing in her own belly a little sharper, but the ache in her chest a little duller. It was that act of foolish kindness that sealed her fate. Lord Valerius saw it all from the window of his carriage. He saw the branded girl, the street urchin, the shared bread. But he didn't see kindness. He saw an opportunity. He was the Alpha King's most trusted advisor, a man whose power was second only to the throne itself. And his power depended on the king remaining precisely as he was, cold, distant, and wrapped in a grief so profound it had frozen the entire kingdom for centuries. Valerius had noticed the king's gaze linger on the girl once or twice as she scurried through the castle's lower courtyards. A fleeting, almost imperceptible interest. It was nothing, likely a trick of the light. But Valerius had not survived this long by ignoring such things. A single spark could ignite a forest fire. A single moment of warmth could begin to thaw a glacier of sorrow, and that he could not allow. The next day, the guards came for her. They stormed the stinking hayloft, their armor gleaming in the dim light. They accused her of stealing a silver locket from the Lady Annalise, Lord Valerius's own niece. Ilara denied it, her voice trembling but firm. She had never been near the lady's chambers. She had been scrubbing the kennels all morning. It didn't matter. They held up the locket, claiming they found it in her meager sack of belongings. They dragged her out into the biting wind, her protests lost in the clatter of their steel boots on the cobblestones. They dragged her through the city, the whispers and jeers of the crowd like stones against her skin. "Thief!" they hissed, pointing at the brand on her hand. Once a thief, always a thief. She was thrown into the throne room. It was a vast cold hall of black granite and ice-veined marble. Banners depicting a snarling white wolf hung from the high rafters, stiff with frost. At the far end, on a throne carved from a single block of obsidian, sat the Alpha King, King Kalin. He was a figure from legend, a being of immense power and sorrow. They said he was centuries old, the last of his line. They said he had not smiled since the great fire that had claimed his mate, his pack, his entire world 200 years ago. They said his heart was a shard of ice. Looking at him now, Alara believed it. He was beautiful in the way a blizzard was beautiful, merciless, vast, and utterly cold. His hair was the color of winter moonlight, long and unbound. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, as if carved from the mountain stone of his fortress. But his eyes were the color of a frozen lake, pale and depthless, holding nothing but an endless, echoing emptiness. Lord Valerius stood beside the throne, his voice smooth and oily as he detailed her crime. "A brazen theft, your majesty. This branded wretch has abused the castle's charity. The evidence is irrefutable." Kaelin's gaze drifted over her. It was not a look of judgment or anger. It was a look of utter disinterest, as if she were a piece of furniture, a speck of dust on the polished floor. The emptiness in his eyes was so complete it felt like a physical force, threatening to swallow her whole. She shivered, and it had nothing to do with the cold. "What is the usual punishment for a repeat offender?" the king asked. His voice was deep, a low rumble like distant thunder, but soft, as if the effort of speaking was too much. "Death, your majesty," Valerius said, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "Or, a life of service. There is always the matter of the beast in the spire." A collective gasp went through the assembled courtiers. The beast. The dragon. The last living monster from the war that had destroyed Kaelin's world. It was the king's most prized prisoner, a living monument to his rage and grief. Chained to the highest tower of the castle, it was said to burn any living thing that came near it. Sending someone to tend the beast was a cruel, drawn-out death sentence. The king was silent for a long moment. His gaze fell to her branded hand, which she was trying to hide in the folds of her ragged dress. For the briefest of instants, a flicker of something, pain, memory, she couldn't tell, crossed his features before being buried again beneath the ice. "So be it," he said, his voice flat. "She will serve the beast." Alara's knees buckled. No, not that. Anything but that. She opened her mouth to plead, to scream, but no sound came out. Fear had stolen her voice. The guards hauled her to her feet. As they dragged her from the throne room, her eyes locked with the king's one last time, and in that frozen, empty gaze, she saw it again. Not anger, not cruelty, but a grief so vast and ancient it made the entire world feel small. It was the look of a man who had already lost everything and was now just waiting for the end. For the first time, she felt not fear of him, but a strange, aching pity. He was a prisoner too. The dragon's spire was less a room and more a cage open to the sky. The guards shoved her through a heavy iron-bound door and slammed it shut behind her, the bolt thudding home with a sound of finality. Alara stumbled forward onto a wide, circular platform of wind-swept stone. There were no walls, only a low parapet that did little to stop the shrieking wind. In the center of the platform rose a jagged pillar of rock, and chained to it was the dragon. It was magnificent and terrible. Its scales were the color of obsidian and volcanic glass, shimmering even in the dull gray light. It was larger than any horse, its body a coil of immense serpentine power. Great, enchanted chains, glowing with faint blue runes, bound its legs and neck to the central rock. Its wings were tattered, and old scars crisscrossed its hide like angry white rivers. But it was the eyes that held her. They were molten gold, filled not with mindless rage, but with a deep, burning intelligence and a sorrow that mirrored the king's. This was not a beast. This was a being, a prisoner. The dragon lifted its massive head, smoke curling from its nostrils. A low growl rumbled in its chest, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor and up into Alara's bones. It tensed, its muscles bunching. She knew this was it. This was the end. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the fire that would consume her. but it never came. She opened her eyes. The dragon was still watching her, its golden eyes narrowed. It had not moved. It had not attacked. It simply watched. Hours bled into a day, and a day into two. Alara stayed huddled against the far parapet, as far from the beast as she could get. The wind was relentless, and the cold was a physical pain. The guards left a bucket of water and a stale loaf of bread by the door each morning, a cruel pretense of care. She was meant to die of exposure or fear if the dragon didn't kill her first, but the dragon did nothing. It watched her with those ancient, sorrowful eyes. It never slept, it seemed. Just watched. On the third day, a terrible, rattling cough shook the dragon's frame. It was a deep, wet sound of sickness. She saw a tremor run through its massive limbs. It was ill and starving. She looked at the loaf of bread in her hands. It was the same choice she had faced with the little boy in the alley. Her survival, or another's. Slowly, her limbs stiff with cold and fear, she stood up. The dragon's head snapped up, a warning growl rumbling in its throat. She ignored it. Step by painful step, she walked toward the beast, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stopped just outside the range of its chains, her body trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, her voice a reedy thing in the howling wind. She placed her entire loaf of bread on the stone floor, then backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the dragon's. It watched her retreat, its golden gaze unblinking. It looked at the bread, then back at her. It did not eat it. But it didn't burn it either. From a slit of a window in the tower opposite, Kalen watched. He had watched her for 3 days. He had expected her to scream, to beg, to break. He had expected the dragon, Ignis, to incinerate her on sight, as he had the dozen other prisoners sent there over the decades. But neither had happened. He watched the small branded girl leave her own meager food for the creature that was the living symbol of his greatest failure. He saw not terror in her eyes, but a strange, quiet compassion. It was a language he had long forgotten. He felt a stirring in the frozen sea of his chest, a flicker of something that was not pain, not grief, not rage. It was curiosity. The next morning, when Alara went to the door, the rations were different. The bread was fresh. There was a small wedge of cheese, and a thick woolen blanket lay folded beside the water bucket. She stared at it, confused. She assumed one of the guards had taken pity on her. A foolish, dangerous thought, but she wrapped the blanket around herself, the warmth a shocking luxury. She offered the cheese to the dragon. This time, after a long hesitation, the great beast lowered its head and delicately picked it up with its teeth, swallowing it in a single gulp. It was a beginning. Days turned into weeks. A strange, silent routine formed between them. Alara would talk to the dragon, her voice soft and steady against the wind. She told it about her life, about the brand, about the little boy. She didn't know if it understood, but its golden eyes would follow her, and the deep, constant growl in its chest would soften. She named him Ignis, for the fire he held inside. The quality of her provisions continued to improve. A skin of mulled wine appeared one night, warm to the touch. Another time, a portion of roasted meat. She shared it all with Ignis. She noticed the deep, infected wounds along his flank, wounds that wept and refused to heal. The enchanted chains seemed to sap his strength, his fire. She found herself inching closer each day. She no longer feared the fire. She saw only the pain. She saw the loneliness. He was just like her, branded, caged, alone. One afternoon, the coughing fit that seized Ignis was the worst yet. He collapsed onto the stone, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps. A wave of pity so strong it felt like a physical blow washed over Alara. Without thinking, she rushed forward, inside the circle of his chains, and fell to her knees beside his great scaled head. He could kill her. A flick of his tail, a snap of his jaws, a single burst of flame, and she would be ash. His golden eyes flew open, wide with shock. A growl started in his throat, but it died as she reached out a trembling hand. She didn't touch him. Not yet. She just held her hand out, palm up. The brand was stark against her pale skin. "It's all right," she whispered, her own tears blurring her vision. "I know it hurts. I know." Slowly, hesitantly, the great beast lowered his head, his snout coming to rest inches from her hand. He could feel a strange warmth emanating from her, a gentle pulse that had nothing to do with heat. It was calm. It was peace. Kalen watched from his window, his heart, a thing he thought long dead, hammering in his chest. He saw her step inside the dragon's guard. He saw her reach for the beast. He was about to shout for his own guards, to storm the tower, but he stopped. He saw the dragon's reaction, the stillness, the acceptance. For 200 years, Ignis had been a vessel for his own unrelenting rage. The dragon's fire was his fire. The dragon's pain was his pain. And this girl, this broken, branded girl, was soothing it. She was touching the raw, exposed nerve of his soul, and instead of recoiling, it was leaning into her. He began to visit the spire himself, late at night when the castle was asleep. He wouldn't enter. He would stand outside the heavy door, listening to the impossible sound of her soft voice mingling with the dragon's quiet, rumbling breaths. He was drawn to her, to the light she seemed to carry within her, a light that defied the darkness of her life. He found himself thinking of her not as the thief, but as Alara. He left her a book of old tales one night, tucked beside her food. The next night, he heard her reading aloud to the dragon, her voice weaving stories of ancient magic and forgotten kings into the cold air. A part of him he thought was frozen solid began to ache. It was the ache of a thaw. Lord Valerius was no fool. He saw the change in the king, the subtle shift in his posture, the way his gaze was now perpetually fixed on the dragon's spire. He saw the special provisions being ordered from the kitchens, the fine blankets taken from the royal stores. He saw the king returning from his late-night walks with a look on his face that Valerius had not seen in 2 centuries. It was not happiness, but it was no longer emptiness. It was hope. And hope was a threat. Hope would shatter the perfect, miserable stasis Valerius had so carefully maintained. A grieving king was a pliable king. A healing king would begin to ask questions, to look closely at the affairs of his kingdom, to see the web of deceit Valerius had woven in his name. The girl had to go. And the dragon, the anchor of the king's grief, had to be destroyed. One blustering, snow-swept evening, Alara finally did it. Ignis was shivering, his breath shallow. The cold was sinking deep into his bones, extinguishing his inner fire. She could feel his pain as if it were her own. She crept to his side, her heart in her throat, and laid her hand gently on his massive snout. His skin was not hot, as she expected, but cool and smooth, like river stones. A tremor went through him, but he did not pull away. She closed her eyes and poured all her empathy, all her desperate wish to ease his suffering, into that single point of contact. A faint warmth bloomed from her palm, a soft golden light that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. The light was invisible to her, but Ignis felt it. A low, contented rumble, the first she had ever heard from him, vibrated up her arm. Tears streamed down her face. Tears for his pain, for her own, for the shared, crushing loneliness that bound them together in this cage in the sky. She touched the monster, and she wept. That was the moment the door to the spire crashed open. Lord Valerius stood there, flanked by 6 of his most loyal guards. They were armed with heavy, cruel-looking spears, their tips dripping with a black, viscous poison. "The beast has ensnared the girl," Valerius shouted, his voice ringing with false alarm. "It has finally broken its enchantments. We must put it down before it destroys us all." Ilara scrambled back, her heart seizing with terror. "No, he's done nothing." Ignis surged to his feet, the chains groaning. A true, furious roar ripped from his throat for the first time, a torrent of sound and fury. He shielded Ilara with his body, his golden eyes blazing with protective fire. He was weak, sick, but he would defend her. "You see? It's gone mad," Valerius cried, leveling his spear. The guards advanced. Ignis unleashed a plume of flame, not at them, but as a warning shot that licked the stone ceiling. It was weaker than it should have been, tinged with black smoke. The poison in the chains had done its work over the centuries. "Kill it!" Valerius screamed. The guards charged. They jabbed and thrust with the poisoned spears. Ignis roared in pain as one of the tips sliced across his flank, the black poison sizzling on his scales. He snapped his jaws, catching one guard and flinging him against the parapet. But he was outnumbered, chained, and weakened. Ilara screamed, a raw, helpless sound. She did the only thing she could think to do. She ran forward and threw herself in front of Ignis, her arms spread wide. "Stop! Leave him alone!" Valerius sneered, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. This was perfect. 2 birds with 1 stone. "Fools, both of you!" He raised his spear, aiming directly for her heart. A blur of silver and white exploded into the room. Kaelin. He moved faster than any man should be able to move, a phantom of winter fury. He had been in his study when he felt the surge of Ignis's rage through their ancient, empathetic bond. He had known, instantly, that something was wrong. He slammed into Valerius, sending the advisor sprawling. The king's eyes were no longer frozen lakes. They were glaciers calving into a storming sea, alight with a terrifying, protective rage. The air in the spire crackled with his power, dropping 20 degrees in an instant. "Valerius!" Kaelin snarled, his voice a low, deadly growl. "What is the meaning of this?" "Your Majesty!" Valerius stammered, scrambling to his feet. "The beast! It went wild! I was trying to save the girl, to save the kingdom!" "Liar," Kaelin breathed. The guards, loyal to Valerius, hesitated for a moment, then chose their master. They turned on the king. Kaelin met them with a fury born of 200 years of suppressed pain. He was a whirlwind of motion, disarming 2, disabling a 3rd. But while he was engaged with them, another guard saw his chance. He lunged not at the king, but at Ilara, who was still shielding the wounded Ignis. Kaelin saw the movement. He roared her name. He threw himself in front of her, moving with impossible speed. The poisoned spear, intended for Ilara, sank deep into the king's side. A collective, horrified silence fell over the spire, broken only by the howling of the wind. Kaelin stared down at the spear shaft protruding from his torso, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He slowly turned his eyes to Ilara. "Run," he whispered, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed to the stone floor. The world stopped. Ilara stared at the fallen king, at the black poison already spreading through the veins beneath his pale skin, tracing dark spiderweb cracks across his flesh. The cold radiating from him was no longer just emotional, it was a physical, killing frost. The stone around him began to glaze with ice. The remaining guards, horrified at what they had done, dropped their weapons. Valerius, his face pale with shock and fury at his plan's disastrous turn, backed away toward the door. He was weakened. The girl made him weak, he muttered before turning and fleeing. Ilara didn't notice. She didn't see anything but Kaelin. She scrambled to his side, her hands hovering over the terrible wound. "No," she whispered. The word was a prayer, a denial, a command. "No, you can't." Ignis let out a long, mournful cry, a sound of pure despair. He nudged the king's still form with his snout, a strange, desperate gesture of comfort. Alara gripped Kaelin's hand. It was already colder than ice, the chill seeping into her own skin, a deathly cold that threatened to stop her own heart. She could feel his life force fading, flickering like a guttering candle in a gale. He had saved her. This cold, broken king, who had lost everything, had thrown himself in front of a spear for her. For a branded thief he had sentenced to die. A sob tore from her throat, hot and ragged. "Don't you dare," she wept, her tears splashing onto his frozen hand. "Don't you dare leave me too." She refused. She would not let this happen. She poured every ounce of her will, her love, her desperate, hopeless hope into her grip. She held onto his hand as if she could physically anchor his soul to the world. And then, something broke inside her. A warmth bloomed in her chest, a searing, brilliant heat. It surged down her arms and into her hands. The thief's brand on the back of her hand began to glow, not with the angry red of a burn, but with a pure golden light, as bright and warm as the heart of a star. The light spilled from her hand, engulfing Kaelin's. It was the light of life itself, of healing and renewal. It flowed from her into him, a river of liquid sunshine warring against the encroaching frost. The black veins of poison recoiled from the light, sizzling and turning to dust. The ice on the floor around them melted, steaming in the sudden warmth. Her own dormant power, a magic she never knew she possessed, erupted from the dam of her grief and fear. It was a power of empathy made manifest, the ability to heal not just flesh, but the deep wounds of the soul. The light intensified, filling the entire spire, pushing back the shadows and the storm. It washed over Ignis, and the poisoned wound on his flank began to close, the black ichor evaporating under its touch. The runes on his chains flickered and died, their ancient magic overwhelmed by this pure, untamed force of life. Alara felt the power flowing through her, vast and overwhelming, but it didn't frighten her. It felt like coming home. It felt like her true self, unlocked at last. She held on to Kaelin, her light pouring into him, mending the wound, burning away the poison, and touching the 200-year-old shard of ice around his heart. Slowly, the light subsided, sinking back into her, leaving a soft, warm glow on the brand on her hand. The spire was silent, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing. Kaelin's eyes fluttered open. The pale, frozen blue was gone. In its place was the deep, clear gray of a winter sky after a storm. He looked up at her, his expression one of profound wonder. He lifted his hand, not his wounded one, but the one she still held, and traced the glowing mark on her skin. "Ilara," he breathed. It was the first time he had said her name, and it sounded like a reverence. He sat up, his hand moving to his side. There was no wound, not even a scar. The poison was gone. But more than that, the ancient, numbing cold that had been his constant companion for centuries was gone. In its place was a quiet warmth, a feeling of peace he had thought he would never know again. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a branded thief, but the source of that warmth. He saw the woman who had tamed his dragon, and in doing so had shown him the path back to himself. He stood, his movements fluid and strong, and pulled her gently to her feet. The loyalist castle guards, drawn by the commotion and the impossible light, had arrived and apprehended the few remaining traitors. They stood in the doorway, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. Kaelin ignored them. He looked only at Alara. "He was right," he said, his voice soft but carrying in the sudden stillness. "You did make me weak. Weak enough to feel again." He lifted her branded hand to his lips and kissed the glowing mark. It was not a gesture of a king to a subject. It was a gesture of a man to his equal, to his savior. "My queen," he said, the words clear and absolute. A gasp went through the guards. Ilara stared at him, her heart too full for words. Queen? Her? The girl who was worthless? He seemed to read the doubt in her eyes. His gaze softened. "I saw what was inside you from the very beginning. I just didn't have a name for it. It was the one thing my grief could not extinguish. Hope." Then he did something that shattered the last of her defenses. He turned from her and walked toward Ignis. The great dragon, now free of his enchantments, lowered his head. Kaelin reached out a hand, mirroring the gesture Ilara had made what felt like a lifetime ago, and laid it gently on the dragon's snout. Ignis leaned into the touch, a low, contented rumble vibrating through the chamber. The two prisoners, king and beast, were finally free. 6 months passed. The snows of winter gave way to a tentative northern spring. Ilara was no longer the branded thief. She was Queen Ilara, the light of Eisenrath. The brand on her hand no longer glowed with her untamed power, but it remained, a symbol not of shame, but of her past, of her strength. The people of the kingdom, at first skeptical, had come to love her. They saw the life returning to the land, the warmth returning to their king's rule. They saw her quiet kindness, her work with the city's orphans, her empathy for the lowest of her subjects. She had not forgotten where she came from. Valerius was imprisoned in the deepest dungeons, stripped of his titles and lands. His web of corruption, woven over centuries, was being painstakingly unraveled by Kaelin, who now ruled with a clarity and purpose he had not possessed in ages. Ignis was no longer a prisoner. His wounds were fully healed, his scales gleaming like polished obsidian in the sun. He was a guardian now, not a captive. He spent his days coiled on the sun-warmed stones of the central courtyard, a magnificent, terrifying, and strangely gentle presence at the heart of the castle. The children of the court would often leave him offerings of smoked fish and honey cakes, which he would accept with a dignified delicacy. This evening, Ilara stood on the high balcony of the king's chambers, looking out over the sprawling city as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The air was cool and crisp, but she no longer felt the cold. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and Kaelin pulled her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a solid, comforting warmth. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into her hair. "About a girl in a hayloft," she answered softly, "who was always hungry and always cold." He turned her in his arms, his gray eyes searching hers. The emptiness was long gone, replaced with an emotion so deep and profound, it still sometimes stole her breath. It was love. A love earned through fire and ice, through grief and healing. "I was in a prison far colder than any hayloft," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You walked into my darkness and you did not flinch. You brought the sun with you, Ilara." He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "I love you," he said. The words were not a confession of weakness, or a curse as he had once feared. They were a declaration of strength, the source of his new world. "And I love you," she whispered, her heart full to bursting. He kissed her then, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future they would build together. In the distance, a shadow passed across the rising moon. It was Ignis, taking flight into the twilight, his powerful wings carrying him over the kingdom he now helped to protect. He let out a single triumphant roar that echoed off the mountains, a sound not of rage or pain, but of freedom. Ilara leaned her head against Kaelin's chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She was home. She was loved. She was not the brand on her hand or the whispers of her past. She was a queen. She was a healer. And she was, finally, whole. The world had discarded her, but in the heart of a frozen king and his lonely dragon, she had found her true place. She had saved him, and he had saved her. And together, they would bring the dawn.